Elijah had exactly $11.40 left in the world. He stood in the cold outside the supermarket on Mercer Avenue, staring at the stack of flattened cardboard boxes he'd just pulled from the recycling bay, and made a decision. He picked up every single one. An hour later, his 6-year-old daughter Zoe stood in the middle of an abandoned lot beside a railway underpass, watching her father work, her breath making small clouds in the evening air. "Daddy, what are we building?" Elijah didn't look up from the box he was folding and reinforcing. His hands were already cut from the edges. He was already cold. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. "What do you think we're building?" he said. Zoe walked a slow circle around the rising walls, studying them with the intense seriousness that only 6-year-olds can summon, and then her whole face broke open. "A castle." Elijah looked up at her, at those wide, bright eyes, at that gap-toothed smile aimed at him like a gift, and something in his chest cracked clean down the middle. "Smartest girl I know," he said quietly. She never knew they had nowhere else to go, and he intended to keep it that way. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that someone was already watching. And what that person was about to do would bring an entire city to its knees. Don't go anywhere, because this story is about to change everything you think you know about what a father's love can build. We thank you for your support. Where are you watching from tonight? It's my pleasure to connect with you all. Take a moment to support us by hitting the subscribe button. Ensure to like, comment, and share this video with others. Elijah Williams had not always counted cardboard boxes as a blessing. There was a time, recent enough to still feel like an open wound, distant enough that it sometimes felt like someone else's life, when he had a real home. A 2-bedroom apartment on Sycamore Drive with a working heater, a kitchen that smelled like whatever he was cooking on Sunday mornings, and a front door with a lock that he turned every night with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had earned his rest. That door had been locked for the last time 11 weeks ago. The landlord had been patient, genuinely patient, the kind of patient that made the eventual end feel worse, not better. 4 months of partial payments, 3 months of promises, 2 formal notices, 1 final conversation in the hallway that lasted 4 minutes and ended with a handshake and an apology from both sides, because Raymond Holt was not a bad man and Elijah was not a bad tenant. And none of it mattered, because the math simply did not work anymore. Elijah had packed what he could carry in 2 duffel bags and a backpack. He had carried Zoe out in his arms, asleep, her head on his shoulder, her small fist curled in the fabric of his jacket. She had not woken up until morning. By then, they were somewhere else entirely. He was 36 years old. He had grown up in Clement City, East Side, the kind of neighborhood that taught you early that the difference between surviving and not surviving was mostly a question of stubbornness. His mother Ashley had been stubborn enough for 3 people, which was fortunate because she had raised Elijah largely alone after his father, a long-distance truck driver named Kofi, died in a highway accident when Elijah was 9 years old. Ashley had worked as a seamstress from the living room of their apartment, her sewing machine running from early morning until late at night, the sound of it so constant and so steady that Elijah still associated the hum of machinery with safety, with someone awake and working so you could sleep. She had taught him 2 things above all else. Never let them see you break. And use what you have. There's always something. He had carried both lessons into adulthood like tools in a belt. Quiet, practical, always within reach. He'd earned his construction certification at 22, worked his way up from laborer to site foreman over a decade at Brennan & Associates, one of Clement City's mid-size contractors. He understood materials the way some men understood music. Intuitively, physically, with a feel for what would hold and what would fail. His crew trusted him. His bosses relied on him for the complicated sites, the ones where the margins were tight and the timelines were tighter. And then he'd met Vivienne. Vivienne Regan had come into his life at a community center fundraiser. She was volunteering. He was there because his foreman had bought a table and dragged the whole crew along. She was running the raffle table with the focused efficiency of someone who treated everything like a project worth doing properly. He had bought 3 tickets. 1-0. gone back to buy 3 more just to have a reason to talk to her. She had seen through that immediately and laughed at him for it. He had loved her from approximately that moment. They had dated for 2 years, married quietly at the city courthouse with Ashley and Vivian's sister as witnesses, and moved into the apartment on Sycamore Drive. Zoe arrived 18 months later, fierce and curious and loud, with Vivian's eyes and Elijah's stubbornness. And for a period of time that Elijah now thought of as the good years, life had been full in the way that simple things are full when you are paying attention to them. Then Vivian left. Not to illness, not to tragedy. That at least was what people sometimes assumed when they learned he was a single father, and he never corrected them because the truth was both simpler and harder. Vivian had left because she was unhappy. Had been unhappy for a while, she said. Had tried to make it work, she said. Loved Zoe completely, she said. Loved Elijah. Had loved him. But love, she said, was not always enough to make two people right for each other. She had moved to Portland to be near her sister. She called Zoe every Sunday without fail. She sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts and was, by every measurable standard, a decent and present mother operating from a long distance. Elijah did not speak badly of her to Zoe. Not once. Not even on the nights when the loneliness of single parenthood pressed down on him like a physical weight, and he had nobody to share it with. He was the one who stayed. That was the role he had, and he played it without complaint. For 2 years after Vivian left, he had managed. Tightly, carefully, with the kind of budgeting that required a spreadsheet and a firm relationship with the word no, but he had managed. Work was steady. Zoe was in school. They had a routine that held. Then Brennan and Associates lost a major contract to a larger firm, undercutting their bid by a margin that made the owner, old Pete Brennan, sit down heavily in his office chair and stare at the wall for a long time. The company absorbed the loss for 4 months. Then it couldn't anymore. 14 men were let go on a Thursday afternoon. Elijah was one of them. What followed was the 18 months he didn't let himself think about in sequence. Unemployment benefits that covered half of what they needed. Job applications that went nowhere. A stint doing deliveries that ended when his car, a 2014 Honda that he'd maintained with religious care, finally gave up with a transmission failure that cost more to fix than the car was worth. Odd jobs. Cash work. The slow, grinding process of selling things to cover gaps. His tools first, then his television, then his watch. A good one that Ashley had given him when he made foreman. The partial payments to Raymond Holt. The handshake in the hallway. The 2 duffel bags and the backpack, and Zoe asleep on his shoulder. He had considered the shelter, had walked to the intake desk of the Clement City Family Shelter on a Wednesday morning, with Zoe's hand in his, and stood there for a long moment reading the notice board while the intake coordinator waited. He had thought about the communal sleeping halls, the lack of privacy, the other children Zoe would meet there, and the questions she would ask afterward. He had thought about what his mother would say. Never let them see you break. He had thanked the intake coordinator, picked up a list of resources she offered him, and walked back out into the morning. That afternoon, he had found the empty lot beside the railway underpass on the east side, a forgotten rectangle of cracked ground between the underpass wall and a chain-link fence, invisible to most of the city, sheltered on 2 sides from the wind. And he had begun to build. He knew how to build. That was the thing. He was not a desperate man hammering randomly at cardboard out of panic. He was a trained site foreman with 10 years of construction experience, and he approached the structure the way he had approached every site he'd ever run, with assessment, with planning, with methodical attention to the problems of weather, insulation, drainage, and load. He double-layered the walls, alternating the corrugation direction of the cardboard to maximize rigidity. The same structural principle used in engineered cardboard panels for commercial applications. He used wooden pallets sourced from behind the hardware store on Grant Street for the floor, elevating them off the ground on salvaged bricks to allow drainage beneath and prevent moisture from wicking upward. He reinforced the corners with lengths of timber he found in a skip outside a renovation site. The roof was tarpaulin, 2 layers, the outer one sloped to shed rain, the inner one flat and insulating. He sealed the joins with waterproof tape he'd bought with some of his last dollars because the tape was not optional. The tape was structural. He cut a door flap and weighted its bottom edge so it hung closed in the wind. He added a small vent near the roofline on the leeward side for air circulation. It took him 3 nights to build, working after Zoe was asleep at a friend's house where he'd arranged for her to stay while he sorted some things out. When it was done, he stood back and looked at it in the early morning gray. It was not a house, but it was sound. It was dry. It was better insulated than some of the site huts he'd worked out of over the years. He had used what he had. There was always something. He brought Zoe to see it on a Saturday morning, carrying her on his back the last 2 blocks so she couldn't see where they were going, until he set her down and turned her around and she saw it for the first time. The blue tarpaulin roof, the neat walls, the pallet floor visible through the door flap. "Daddy, what are we building? What do you think we're building?" And when she said castle, when her whole face broke open like that, Elijah had felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not just grief, not just guilt, pride. Complicated, painful, stubborn pride. He had built this for her, with nothing, in the cold and the dark, alone, running on stubbornness and his mother's voice in his head. And his daughter was spinning inside it with her arms out like it was the most magical place she'd ever been. He hung her drawings on the walls with tape. He found a small folding table at a thrift store for $3 and 2 plastic chairs for $1 each. He set up the battery-powered lamp in the corner and arranged their sleeping mats side by side and put Zoe's collection of smooth stones. She had been collecting them for 2 years, from every pavement and car park and river bank they'd ever visited. Along the window ledge he'd cut and covered with a piece of clear plastic sheeting. The window faced east. In the mornings, the light came through it and lit up those stones like something deliberate, like something that belonged. Zoe started at Clement City Elementary that Monday, 3 blocks away, close enough to walk, which was the reason he'd chosen the lot. He walked her there every morning. He picked her up every afternoon. In between he worked, cash jobs, whatever he could find, the car wash on Portland Avenue most mornings, aluminum cans in the afternoons. And he used the library on 5th Street as his base, sitting at one of the computer terminals, sending job applications and working through the resource list the shelter coordinator had given him. He did not tell Zoe they were homeless. He did not use that word around her. Not once. When she asked why they were living in the fort instead of an apartment, he told her they were on an adventure while Daddy sorted out the next place. She accepted this with the easy faith of a child who has no reason yet to doubt her father's version of events. He intended to keep it that way. He intended to find the next place. He just needed time. What he didn't know, on the morning of the 3rd week, when he was outside in the gray pre-dawn cold, reinforcing the eastern wall where the wind had found a new gap, his breath visible, his jacket inadequate, his hands working steadily and quietly while Zoe slept warm inside, was that a black SUV had slowed to a stop at the curb 30 meters away. And the man inside it was watching him. Not with pity, with something much more focused than that. Who was this man? And what exactly did he see when he watched Elijah work in the cold that morning? The answer to that question is the reason a construction crew showed up in that lot 2 months later. But before any of that, things were about to get considerably harder. Because this story, like all real stories, gets darker before the light comes. The first frost came on a Thursday. Elijah knew it was coming. He'd been watching the sky for 2 days, reading the particular gray of it, the way the wind had shifted from a damp cold to a dry biting one that meant the temperature was about to drop seriously. He'd seen that sky 100 times on construction sites when it meant delaying a concrete pour or pulling men off external scaffolding. Here, it meant something more immediate. He spent Wednesday evening reinforcing every gap he could find in the walls, working by lamplight after Zoe was asleep, moving around the outside of the structure in a slow methodical circuit, pressing, taping, stuffing folded newspaper into the places where cold air was finding its way through. He added a second tarpaulin layer to the roof, overlapping the edges and weighting them with salvaged bricks. He found an old moving blanket in the skip behind the furniture store on Adelaide Street and cut it into strips to seal the base of the walls where they met the pallet floor. He worked until close to midnight. Then he sat outside, back against the wall, and looked at the sky. The temperature had already dropped 4 degrees since sundown. He was wearing every layer he owned: 2 shirts, a sweater with a hole in the left elbow, his jacket. He had a pair of gloves with the fingertips cut off that he used for work because full gloves made his hands clumsy. He pulled them on now for warmth rather than work and pushed his hands into his jacket pockets and sat there in the dark, listening. Inside, he could hear Zoe breathing, slow and steady and completely unaware. He exhaled, watched his breath dissolve into the cold air, thought about his mother's apartment across the city, the one he hadn't been able to bring himself to tell her the full truth about, because Ashley was 61 years old with a heart condition and a 1-bedroom apartment and a worry capacity that he refused to overload. He called her every Sunday, told her they were in transition. She asked questions he answered carefully. She said she'd light a candle at church. He hadn't told her about the lot. He hadn't told anyone about the lot. The frost came as predicted. Elijah woke at 5 in the morning to find the outer tarpaulin stiff and white at the edges, the ground outside hard, the air sharp enough to feel in the back of the throat. He checked the inner walls immediately, running his hands along the cardboard, dry. The insulation was holding. The moving blanket strips at the base had done their job. He checked Zoe. She was curled under both their blankets, her stone collection lined up on the eastern window ledge, her face completely peaceful. A small drawing she'd made the night before. A house, as always, this one with a swimming pool that she'd added with a look of great ambition, was taped to the wall above her sleeping mat. He watched her for a moment. Then he went outside and started the day. The car wash on Portland Avenue opened at 7. Elijah was there at 6:50, first in line, because being first meant the supervisor, a heavy-set man named Dex, who communicated primarily in grunts, gave him the full shift instead of sending him home at noon when it was slow. The work was physical and cold, and paid in cash at the end of each shift. $42 for a full day, sometimes $30 if it was slow. He took every hour Dex would give him. He ate once a day at lunchtime, whatever was cheapest at the gas station 2 doors down from the car wash. A hot dog, usually. Sometimes a packet of crackers and a tin of sardines that he ate standing up at the counter. He bought Zoe a hot lunch at school. He had set that up in the first week, a meal account with the school cafeteria, funded carefully, always the first thing he topped up whenever he had cash. Whatever else ran short, that account did not. After the car wash, afternoons were for cans. He had mapped the most productive routes in a 2-mile radius. The streets where the recycling bins overflowed on collection eve. The back alleys behind the bars on Fletcher Street where bottles and cans accumulated in volume. The park on Renton Avenue where weekend crowds left a reliable harvest. He moved through these routes with a large bag over his shoulder and a system. Cans in one section, glass in another, sorted as he went so the recycling center visit was efficient. It was not glamorous work. He did it without complaint and without embarrassment, because his mother had taught him that embarrassment was a luxury and hunger was not, and because every dollar had a destination. Zoe's lunch account, the battery supply for the lamp, the waterproof tape that kept the roof sealed. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was spent without reason. He ran his household, such as it was, with the same discipline he had once run construction sites. Zoe did not know about the cans. He timed the afternoon collection to end before school pickup, stashing the bag behind the chain-link fence at the lot before walking the 3 blocks to the school gates. By the time she came out, backpack bouncing, usually talking before she'd even spotted him, full of information about whatever had happened that day, he was just her father, waiting at the gate. They walked home together every afternoon, and home was the word they used, both of them, without discussion. The fort was home. The stone collection on the window ledge was home. The lamp in the corner, and the $3 folding table, and the drawings on the walls. All of it was home. Because home was not a structure, it was a consistency. And Elijah was nothing if not consistent. He asked her about school every day, listened to the full answer every day, helped her with her reading on the folding table every evening by lamplight. The two of them bent over a library book, her small finger tracking the words, his voice steady and patient beside her. She was reading above her grade level. He was quietly, fiercely proud of this. But the nights were getting harder. After Zoe was asleep, after the patching and the checking and the maintenance that the structure constantly required, there was a window of time, usually between 10 and midnight, when Elijah sat outside alone and let himself feel the things he spent the daylight hours not feeling. The exhaustion was a physical thing, deep in his bones and his joints, the kind that sleep didn't fully fix because sleep itself was compromised. Too cold, too alert, one ear always listening for the sounds that didn't belong. He had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. He could feel it in his clothes, in the looseness of his belt, in the way his face looked in the gas station bathroom mirror on the mornings he stopped in to wash before work. He was 36 years old, and he looked older. More than the exhaustion, though, was the fear. Not a dramatic fear, not panic, not paralysis. A quiet, chronic background fear that ran beneath everything like a current. The fear of the temperature dropping further than the structure could handle. The fear of Zoe getting sick. The fear that a city inspector or a police officer would walk past the lot one morning and the whole fragile construction, not just the cardboard, but the routine, the school, the careful normalcy he was maintaining for his daughter, would come apart. He managed the fear the way he managed everything else. Methodically. One problem at a time. Focus on what you can control and work the problem in front of you. But there were nights when it sat on his chest like something with weight. It was on one of these nights, a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the first frost, the temperature below freezing, Elijah sitting outside in every layer he owned, that he heard the sound. A car, slowing. He looked up. A black SUV had pulled to the curb on the road that ran along the edge of the lot. Its engine was running, its headlights on. Through the windshield, in the orange wash of the street lamp, he could see the shape of a driver. Elijah watched it. The SUV sat there for perhaps 40 seconds. Then it pulled away slowly and disappeared around the corner. He stared after it for a moment. Then he went back to what he was doing, reinforcing the base of the north wall where the cold was finding a new path through. His hands working in the dark with the steady automatic confidence of someone who has done this enough times that the hands know what to do without being told. He forgot about the car. He had more immediate things to think about. The immediate thing, that particular week, was Zoe's shoes. She had one pair, a pair of white trainers that had been bought in September, already half a size too small by November, now visibly tight across the toes. He'd noticed her taking them off the moment she got home each afternoon, an automatic gesture she hadn't commented on, and when he'd asked her about it, she'd said her feet were just hot. He'd held the shoe in his hand that night, pressing his thumb against the toe box, feeling where her foot was pushing against the material. He needed $14 for the cheapest replacement pair at the discount store on Mercer. He had 9. He ran an extra afternoon collection route on Wednesday and Thursday. Saturday morning, he found a bag of clothing someone had left beside the recycling bins on Mercer Avenue and sorted through it, nothing useful for him, but a pair of children's winter boots, barely worn, size 4. Zoe was a size 3.5. He stuffed the toes with folded socks. She put them on and walked around the fort experimentally and pronounced them excellent, which was her current favorite word, applied to everything that met her standards. He had exhaled for what felt like the first time in a week. What he did not know was that on Thursday evening, while he was running his extra collection route along Fletcher Street, the black SUV had parked at the curb by the lot again. And this time, the driver had gotten out. Not to approach the structure, not to interfere with anything, just to stand at the edge of the lot in the cold evening air and look at it. He stood there for a long time, looking at the double-layered walls, the sloped tarpaulin roof, weighted at the edges, the pallet floor raised off the ground on salvaged bricks, the sealed door flap, the small east-facing window with its plastic sheeting. He was a man who understood construction, who had spent 30 years in the industry, who had looked at thousands of structures and understood immediately what he was seeing, what was sound and what was not, what had been built with knowledge and what had been built with luck. What he was looking at had not been built with luck. He stood there in the cold, this man whose name Elijah did not yet know, and he looked at the structure for a long time. Then he took out his phone, made a call, said 4 words to whoever answered. "I found our guy." Who was this man? What did he mean? And what exactly was he planning? Elijah was about to find out, but not before the hardest night of the entire 2 months. A night that would push him to the absolute edge of everything he had. Don't go anywhere. If you're still watching, comment "I love my family" below with a love emoji attached. The storm came on a Friday night. Elijah had seen it on the weather screen at the library that afternoon. A deep pressure system moving in from the northwest, the kind the meteorologist described with the particular careful language that meant this one is serious. Predicted overnight low of -11. Wind gusts up to 60 kilometers per hour. Possible freezing rain transitioning to snow by morning. He had sat in front of that screen for a moment longer than necessary. Then he had closed the browser, packed up his things, collected Zoe from school, and walked home at a slightly faster pace than usual. He had 4 hours before it hit. He worked with everything he had. He sent Zoe inside with instructions to organize her stone collection, a task that would occupy her with complete absorption for at least 40 minutes. And he moved around the outside of the structure in a fast, systematic circuit. Hands and eyes checking every seal, every join, every point where wind could find purchase. He added a 3rd tarpaulin layer to the roof. One he'd been storing folded under the pallet floor against exactly this kind of night. He ran an additional rope line across the top and staked it into the ground on both sides, because the existing anchors were adequate for ordinary wind, and this was not going to be ordinary wind. He packed the base of every wall with a berm of soil and rubble, a technique he'd used on site huts in exposed locations, creating a low windbreak at ground level that interrupted the worst of the lateral gusts before they found the wall. He checked the door flap, restitched 2 of the ties that had been weakening for a week, with a length of wire he'd been meaning to use for exactly this purpose. He moved fast, and he moved precisely, and he did not allow himself to think about anything except the next problem and the solution to it. "Daddy, why are you doing so much stuff to the castle?" Zoe was standing in the doorway, watching him with her head tilted. "Winter maintenance," he said without breaking his rhythm. "Every good castle needs winter maintenance." "Like a checkup?" "Exactly like a checkup." She considered this. "Can I help?" He looked at her, at the thin jacket she was wearing, the stuffed boots on her feet. "You can be the quality inspector," he said. "Go around every wall inside and tell me if you can feel any cold air coming through anywhere." Her face transformed. This was a job, a real one with a title. She disappeared back inside immediately. He heard her moving along the walls, pressing her palms flat, muttering to herself with great seriousness. "North wall, good. East wall, there's a tiny bit here, Daddy, near the bottom left." "I've got it," he called back. He was already at that corner with the tape. By the time the first serious gusts arrived, just after 8 in the evening, a low moan building to something harder, the tarpaulin beginning its urgent snapping. Zoe was inside, fed in her pajamas, under both blankets with her stone collection arranged along the window ledge, and a library book open in her lap. Elijah sat beside her and read with her until her eyes began closing over the pages, which took less time than usual because she could hear the wind, and it was making her sleepy the way weather sometimes does with children. A primal response, the body saying you are warm and inside and you can let go. She was asleep by 9. He sat with her for a few minutes after, listening to her breathe, listening to the wind climb. Then he went outside. He needed to monitor the roof anchors through the night. This was not a choice, it was a structural necessity. In wind this strong, the ropes needed checking every hour or so. The tension adjusted as the tarpaulin flexed and the stakes shifted in the ground. He had done this before on exposed construction sites, sitting out through bad nights to nurse temporary structures through weather that hadn't been accounted for in the schedule. It was unglamorous, technical, lonely work. He settled against the eastern wall, the leeward side, slightly sheltered from the main wind direction, with his knees pulled up and his jacket zipped to the throat and his cut-off gloves on his hands, and he began his vigil. The temperature dropped fast. By 10 o'clock, the freezing rain had started, not heavy, but horizontal in the gusts, finding every gap in his clothing with a precision that felt personal. He tucked his chin into his collar and pulled his sleeves down over the gloves and thought about heat, which was a technique he'd read about somewhere. Visualizing warmth as a physical thing, something you could generate with focus. It didn't work especially well, but it gave his mind something to do. At 11, the first rope anchor pulled. He felt it before he heard it. A change in the rhythm of the tarpaulin above him, the snapping becoming more erratic. A new frequency in the sound that meant one corner had gone slack. He was on his feet immediately, moving to the northwest corner, hands finding the stake in the dark, driving it back in deeper with the heel of his palm, retensioning the rope with fingers that were stiff enough, now that he had to think about the movements consciously, commanding each finger separately. He got it secured, moved back to his position on the eastern wall. The rain intensified. At midnight, he checked inside. Zoe was still asleep. The interior walls were dry. The temperature inside was cold but survivable. His rough estimate put it at 4 or 5 degrees above zero in there, which was the difference between uncomfortable and dangerous. The double wall insulation was doing its job. The berm at the base was holding the worst of the ground draft. He stood over his daughter for a moment, listening to the storm rage outside the cardboard walls he had built for her, and he felt something move through him that was not quite any single emotion, but a compound of all of them. Exhaustion and love and fear and pride and grief and a stubbornness so deep it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a physical characteristic. Like bone density, like something he'd been born with. He was not going to let this beat him. He was not going to let anything get to her. He went back outside. The worst of it came between 1 and 3 in the morning. Wind gusts that hit the structure like something deliberate, like something that had a point to make. The tarpaulin was screaming. 2 more anchors pulled in a 20-minute window, and he worked them back in with hands that had passed through cold and out the other side into a deep, bone-level ache that he had learned to operate through on bad winter sites years ago. His boots were soaked through. The freezing rain had transitioned to sleet, small and hard and relentless. He worked. When there was nothing to fix, he sat against the wall and kept watch. When something needed fixing, he fixed it. That was the whole of it. That was all there was. At 2:40 in the morning, sitting against the eastern wall with his arms wrapped around his knees, he allowed himself, briefly, privately, in the complete darkness and the howl of the storm, to come apart a little. Not much. Not for long. But he put his face down against his knees and he shook once hard, like something that had been held too tight for too long and needed a single moment of release. He thought about Ashley at her sewing machine. He thought about Vivienne laughing at him in the hardware store parking lot. He thought about the green front door he'd never gotten around to having. He thought about the Elijah he'd been 5 years ago, who would not have been able to imagine this night, this cold, this particular species of exhaustion and loneliness. He gave himself 60 seconds. Then he raised his head, wiped his face on his sleeve, and looked up at the tarpaulin to check the tension on the north rope. It needed tightening. He got up and tightened it. By 4 in the morning, the worst had passed. The wind dropped from a roar to a persistent moan. The sleet thinned and stopped, and a strange, exhausted quiet settled over the lot. Elijah stood in the middle of the open ground and looked at the structure. It was standing. Every wall, every seal, every anchor he'd driven back in through the night. It was all standing. He stood there in the post-storm dark, soaked and hollow with cold, and so tired his vision was doing something strange at the edges, and he looked at what he had built and what he had held together through the worst night of the winter. And he thought, quietly, without drama, with the simple clarity of a man at the end of his resources, I cannot keep doing this. Not as defeat, not as surrender, as information, as data. as the kind of honest assessment he would have given on any site where the conditions had exceeded the design parameters. The structure was sound. He had kept her safe. But he was one man, and the winter was not finished, and he was running out of the physical reserves that the nights like this one cost him. Something had to change. He just didn't know what, or how. He was still standing there, dawn just beginning to gray the eastern sky, his breath visible, his shadow long across the frost-stiffened ground when he heard the sound. A car engine. Slow. Deliberate. He turned. The black SUV was back. This time it didn't stay at the curb. It pulled into the edge of the lot and stopped. The engine cut. The door opened. A man got out. He was in his late 50s, Elijah estimated. Broad through the shoulders. Work boots, dark trousers, a heavy jacket. The kind of build and the kind of clothes that said, "I have worked with my hands and I have not forgotten it." He stood beside his car and looked across the lot at Elijah. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then the man looked, slowly, deliberately, at the structure. At the walls, the roof, the anchors, the berm at the base. He looked at it the way someone looks at something when they are reading it, when they understand the language it's written in. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked back at Elijah. "How long have you been out here tonight?" he said. His voice was even, direct, not unkind. Elijah looked at him steadily. "Since 8, he said. The man nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. He reached into his jacket, produced a business card, and held it out across the space between them. Elijah didn't move immediately. "My name is Douglas Hearn," the man said. "I own Hearn & Sons Construction. I've been driving past this lot for 6 weeks. He paused. "I know what I'm looking at, and I'd like to talk to you." Elijah looked at the card, looked at the man, looked back at the structure. At the walls he had built with $11 and nothing else. At the roof he had held together through the night with his bare, cold hands. At the east-facing window where, in an hour, the light would come through and illuminate his daughter's stone collection, like something that belonged there. He walked forward and took the card. Douglas Hearn had seen a lot of things in 30 years of construction, but he had never seen anything quite like what he'd watched over those 6 weeks. And what he was about to offer Elijah was not charity. It was something the man had earned every single night in that lot without knowing anyone was watching. But first, Elijah had a decision to make, and it wasn't as simple as it looked. The card was simple. No logo, no tagline, just a name, a number, and 3 words beneath it. Hearn & Sons Construction. Elijah turned it over in his fingers. The stock was heavy, cream-colored, the kind of card that didn't need to announce itself because the quality of it did that quietly on its own. He'd seen cards like this before, on the desks of the men who signed the big contracts, the men who owned the companies rather than ran the sites. He looked up at Douglas Hearn. "You said you wanted to talk," Elijah said, "so talk." It came out more direct than he'd intended. 6 weeks of no sleep and a full night in a freezing storm had stripped away whatever social cushioning he might otherwise have applied. He was too tired for preamble, too tired for the careful dance of strangers feeling each other out. Douglas Hearn didn't seem bothered by it. If anything, something in his expression settled, like directness was a language he preferred and was relieved to be spoken to in. "Not here," Hearn said. He glanced toward the structure. "Your daughter inside? She's asleep. There's a diner on Clement Avenue, opens at 6. He checked his watch. 40 minutes. I'll buy you breakfast and I'll say what I have to say. After that, whatever you decide is your business." Elijah looked at him for a long moment. Everything in him that had learned over the past 18 months to be careful, to assess before trusting, to look for the angle in every offer, because there was always an angle. That part of him was running its checks. Reading the man in front of him the way he'd learned to read a site before he committed his crew to it. What he saw was a man who was not performing anything. Not pity. Not philanthropy. Not the particular careful kindness of someone who wanted to feel good about themselves before driving back to their comfortable life. Just a man standing in a cold lot at 5 in the morning, direct and patient, waiting. "I need to be back before she wakes up," Elijah said. "I'll have you back in an hour." Hearn said. He left a note for Zoe. "Gone to get breakfast supplies. Back very soon. Do not leave the fort." waited under her stone collection, where she would find it immediately. He had done this before on the rare mornings he needed to move before she woke, and she understood the system. He walked to Clement Avenue with Douglas Hearn, and neither of them spoke much on the way, which suited Elijah fine. The city was doing the quiet thing it did in the early morning before it fully committed to the day. A delivery truck here, a lone jogger there. The streetlights still on against a sky that hadn't decided yet between night and morning. The diner was warm in the aggressive way that old diners are warm, the heat hitting you at the door like a physical welcome. A woman behind the counter, name tag reading Bev, the kind of face that has been friendly to strangers for 40 years and finds it effortless, nodded at Hearn with the recognition of a regular. Usual, Douglas? 2 usuals, Bev. And coffee. Lot of coffee. They slid into a booth by the window. Elijah wrapped both hands around the mug Bev set down in front of him and felt the heat move through his palms and up his arms, and he closed his eyes for just a second. When he opened them, Douglas Hearn was watching him with an expression that was neither pity nor discomfort. "When did you last sleep a full night?" Hearn asked. "I don't remember," Elijah said honestly. Hearn nodded, poured his coffee, said nothing for a moment. Then he leaned forward, both forearms on the table, and looked at Elijah with the direct, steady focus of a man who had made a decision and was now simply delivering it. "I'm going to tell you what I've seen," Hearn said. "And then I'm going to tell you what I want. And I need you to hear both parts before you respond. Can you do that?" Elijah nodded. "6 weeks ago, I drove past that lot on my way to a site assessment on the east side. I saw a man in the dark building something out of cardboard. I almost didn't stop, but something made me pull over and look." He paused. "I looked for about 10 minutes before I drove on." "I never saw you stop," Elijah said. "I know. You were working. You weren't looking at the road." Hearn wrapped his hands around his own mug. "What I saw in those 10 minutes, the way you were approaching the build, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I drove past again the next day, and the day after. I started going out of my way to drive past that lot." Elijah said nothing. "I've been in construction for 30 years, Hearn continued. "I started as a laborer at 19. My father owned a small firm, 2 trucks and 6 men. I grew it. We're 68 staff now. Residential, commercial, some civil work. Last year we turned over 14 million. He said it without vanity, as context rather than boast. "In 30 years I have hired a lot of men, a lot of foremen. I know what I'm looking at when I watch someone work." He leaned forward slightly. "What I watched you do over 6 weeks, the way you assessed that structure and kept improving it, the drainage solution, the insulation layering, the anchor system on that roof, I've had qualified engineers produce less considered solutions to weather problems on real sites. You built that with scrap material and construction knowledge and a problem-solving instinct that you cannot teach. I know because I've tried to teach it, and I've mostly failed." He paused. "Last night I drove past at 2 in the morning. You were working those roof anchors in the middle of that storm." Elijah's jaw tightened slightly. There was something uncomfortable about being seen that thoroughly, about having the private hours of his endurance witnessed and named. "My daughter was inside," he said. It was not quite a defense, more a statement of the only fact that mattered. "I know," Hearn said quietly. "That's the other thing I've been watching." Bev arrived with 2 plates, eggs, toast, bacon, the kind of breakfast that required no decision-making because it was simply everything. Elijah looked at the plate. His stomach contracted sharply. He hadn't had a hot meal since he tried to calculate. Tuesday. It was now Saturday morning. He ate. He tried to do it with some measure of restraint and largely failed. Hearn ate too, unhurried, giving Elijah the space to eat without conversation, which was a small and considered kindness that Elijah noted and did not acknowledge and filed away. When the plates were mostly cleared, Hearn poured more coffee and said what he'd come to say. "I want to offer you a job," he said. "Site foreman. Starting salary $62,000. Full benefits, health cover included. Starts as soon as you're able." Elijah set his mug down. 62,000 was more than he'd earned at Brennan and Associates at the height of his tenure there. Benefits. Health cover, which meant Zoe covered, which meant he stopped that line of thinking before it ran too far ahead. "Why?" he said. Hearn looked at him steadily. Because you're exactly the kind of site foreman I need and have been struggling to find for 8 months. I've had 3 in that role in the past 2 years. 1 left for a bigger firm. 1 couldn't handle the crew dynamics. 1 was technically competent but couldn't think on his feet when conditions changed. He paused. You spent 6 weeks thinking on your feet under conditions that would have broken most people. I'll take that over a CV every time. You don't know me, Elijah said. You've watched me from a car. I know what I've seen. That's not the same as knowing someone's work record, their references, whether they can manage a crew of 20 men on a commercial site. Hearn almost smiled. You're arguing against yourself. I'm pointing out that this isn't how hiring works. My company, my hiring process. Hearn's voice was even. I've also done my homework. Raymond Holt at Brennan & Associates remembers you, said you were the best site foreman he had, said losing you in the restructure was the decision that cost them the most long-term. He held Elijah's gaze. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm filling a position I need filled with the best person I've found for it. The circumstances that brought you to my attention are irrelevant to the job offer. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Outside the diner window, Clement City was waking up properly now. More cars, a woman walking a dog, the first bus of the morning rolling past. The ordinary Saturday morning machinery of a city that had been running without him for 18 months, indifferent, continuous, unchanged by anything that had happened in a cardboard structure beside a railway underpass. There's the matter of, he started. Housing, Hearn said. I know. I can't start a job without a stable address. I can't give Zoe a stable school situation without. I know, Hearn said again. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, set it on the table, slid it across. Elijah looked at it without picking it up. What is this? That lot you're on, Hearn said. I looked it up. It's been sitting in the city's derelict property register for 11 years. Nobody owns it. Nobody wants it. It costs the city money to maintain the register entry. He nodded at the document. I've been in conversation with the city planning office for 3 weeks. That document is a preliminary approval for a residential build on that lot. 12-week build, my crew, my materials. Elijah stared at him. You want to build on that lot, he said slowly. I want to build you a house on that lot, Hearn said. 2-bedroom. Proper foundations, brick and mortar, everything to code. It'll be in your name. Call it a signing bonus. The word landed in the warm air of the diner and sat there. Signing bonus, not charity, not handout, not the careful distancing language of pity. A transaction between 2 men, both of whom brought something to the table. Elijah picked up the document, read it. It was exactly what Hearn had described. Preliminary planning approval, lot designation, proposed build specifications. It was real. It had city stamps on it. His hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. He set the document down, looked at Douglas Hearn across the table. I need to think about it, he said. Hearn nodded immediately. No hesitation, no pressure. Take the time you need. I'm not saying no, Elijah said. I'm saying I need to think. Understood. Elijah looked out the window. A father was walking past with a small child on his shoulders, the child holding the man's forehead with both hands, laughing at something. The father's hands locked around the small ankles, sure and steady. He thought about Zoe waking up in the fort, finding his note, arranging her stones on the window ledge while she waited. He thought about -11 degrees and roof anchors and 60 seconds of falling apart against a cardboard wall at 2:40 in the morning. He thought about what his mother had told him. Use what you have. There is always something. He had used what he had. Every single day. Down to the last thread of it. And now something had shown up. The question was whether he could let himself believe it was real. He was back at the lot in 50 minutes as promised. Zoe was awake, cross-legged on her sleeping mat, stone collection rearranged into a new configuration she wanted to show him, his note folded neatly in her lap. You were gone a long time, she said. Not accusatory, just factual. I know, baby. I'm sorry. He sat down beside her, looked at the stone arrangement. What's this one? It's a map, she said seriously, of where we're going to live when we get our real house. He looked at the stones, the careful geography of them. The largest stone in the center, that's the house, Daddy, and the smaller ones radiating outward. Garden, garden. This is the road, this is the school, this one is the library. He sat there on the sleeping mat in the cardboard fort he had built for her, in the cold morning light coming through the east-facing window, and he looked at his daughter's map of a future she had been planning all along. And something in his chest, something that had been locked for a very long time, came quietly, carefully open. He called Douglas Hearn that afternoon. 1 ring. 2 Hearn. "It's Elijah Williams," he said. "I've thought about it." A pause, brief, unhurried. "And?" Elijah looked at the east window, at the stones on the ledge catching the afternoon light. "I'll take the job," he said. He said yes, but saying yes was only the beginning. Because when Douglas Hearn's construction crew showed up at that lot 2 months later, what happened next was something not even Hearn himself had fully anticipated. And the moment Zoe saw it, the moment she understood what was being built and why, it would become the moment that stopped an entire city in its tracks. The crew showed up on a Monday morning, 6:45, before the city had fully committed to the day, before the school-run traffic had built on Clement Avenue, before the car wash on Portland Avenue had opened its shutters. Elijah was outside the fort doing his morning check of the walls, a habit so deep now it operated below conscious thought, his hands moving along the seams automatically while his mind was elsewhere, when he heard the trucks. Not one truck. 3. A flatbed carrying timber and steel, a concrete mixer, its drum already turning with the slow, patient rhythm of a machine that knows it has work to do, and a crew van, white, Hearn & Sons lettered on the side in clean dark blue, that pulled up behind the flatbed and disgorged 8 men in high-visibility vests who moved with the coordinated purposefulness of a crew that had been briefed and knew exactly why they were there. Douglas Hearn stepped out of a black SUV behind them. He walked across the lot to where Elijah was standing and extended his hand. "Ready?" he said. Elijah shook it. "Ready." He had spent the 2 months since the diner breakfast moving fast and carefully through every step that needed moving through. The job had started in the first week, site foreman on a commercial renovation project in the north of Clement City, a 3-story office building being stripped and rebuilt to the waterline. Hearn had introduced him to the crew on day 1 with the straightforward economy of a man who didn't believe in lengthy preambles. "This is Elijah Williams. He's your foreman. What he says on site is what happens on site." And then Hearn had walked away and left Elijah to it. The crew had assessed him the way construction crews always assessed a new foreman, with a specific combination of patience and skepticism, waiting to see whether the authority was real or decorative. He'd encountered this before. He knew how to meet it. He'd spent the first morning walking the site alone, slowly reading it, the existing structure, the problem areas, the sequencing logic of the strip out that the previous foreman had planned. By afternoon, he'd identified 3 sequencing errors that would have cost them a week further down the line and quietly reorganized the schedule. He didn't announce it. He just did it. By the end of the first week, the skepticism had largely dissolved. By the end of the second, a man named Terrence, the eldest on the crew, 20 years in the trade, the kind of presence that sets the tone for everyone else, had taken to arriving 5 minutes early each morning to run through the day's plan with Elijah before the others got there. Not because Elijah had asked him to, because Terrence had decided it was worth his time. That was the signal Elijah had been waiting for. The pay had changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Everything. Zoe's lunch account was full. His own meals were regular. He'd bought a new pair of boots, the proper kind, steel toe-capped, the kind his feet had been missing for 8 months. He'd opened a bank account, had been operating in cash so long that the card they sent him felt faintly surreal. A thin piece of plastic that represented a stability he kept expecting to dissolve. Nothing. He was still in the fort, still rising at 5. Still patching and checking and maintaining because the build on the lot hadn't started yet. The planning approvals had moved at the speed planning approvals move, which is to say with a bureaucratic patience that tests a man's composure. And he had decided, quietly and firmly, that he would not take temporary accommodation while the build was pending. He had reasons. Some of them were practical, the disruption to Zoe's school routine, the cost of even a short-term rental, against the financial recovery he was trying to build. Some of them were less practical, and more to do with a principle he couldn't quite articulate, except to say that he built this place and held it together, and he was not going to leave it until he left it for something permanent. Ashley, when he had finally told her the full truth over the phone one Sunday evening, had been silent for a very long time. Then she had said, in a voice he recognized as the one she used when she was holding herself very still, "You should have told me, Elijah." "I know, Mama." Another silence. "Are you both safe?" "We're both safe." "Is she eating?" "She's eating well." A long breath. "Then your father would have done the same thing, built the whole world from nothing before he asked for help." A pause. "I don't know whether that's a compliment." "Neither do I," he said. She had laughed then, a short, watery laugh, and told him she was coming to visit on Saturday, and he had said yes. And when she arrived and stood at the edge of the lot and looked at the fort, she had pressed her lips together very hard and said nothing for a full minute. Then she had gone inside and looked at the drawings on the walls and the stone collection on the window ledge and the $3 folding table, and she had turned around and looked at her son and said, very quietly, "You kept her safe." "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. And that was the whole of it. The planning approval came through on a Thursday afternoon. An email to the address Hearn's office had set up for him, formal and bureaucratic, and the most beautiful thing he had read in years. He had sat with it on his phone screen in the site office at the end of the workday, reading it 3 times, and then he had called Hearn. "We're clear," Hearn said, before Elijah had spoken. "I just saw it. We start Monday." "Monday," Elijah repeated. 6:45. "Have her there." Elijah paused. "She doesn't know yet." "I know," Hearn said. "That's your call. But I'd have her there." He had thought carefully about how to tell Zoe. He had considered several approaches: the practical explanation, the gradual reveal, the careful measured conversation designed to manage expectations. He had workshopped versions of it in his head on the walk to school, on the drive to the work site, in the quiet of the fort after she was asleep. In the end, he said nothing. He simply woke her on Monday morning, earlier than usual, told her to get dressed in her warmest things because there was something outside she needed to see, and walked her out into the gray 6:45 morning. She stopped, looked at the trucks, the crew in their high-visibility vests, the flatbed with its timber and steel, the concrete mixer turning. Looked at her father. "What's happening to our castle?" she said. Her voice was careful, not frightened, but alert, the way a child sounds when they are trying to read an adult situation and haven't found the key to it yet. Elijah crouched down to her level. He looked at her face, at her mother's eyes, wide and dark, aimed at him with that absolute trust that had undone him 100 times and was undoing him now. And he made a decision about how much truth to tell a 6-year-old. And the decision was, all of it. She had earned all of it. "You know how we've been on an adventure?" he said. She nodded. "The adventure is ending," he said, "because we're building something better." She looked at the crew, at the trucks, at Douglas Hearn, who was standing at a respectful distance, hands in his jacket pockets, watching. "Those men are building us a house?" she said. "A real one," Elijah said. "On this exact spot, so it'll always be ours." Zoe looked at the lot, at the scrubby ground, the railway underpass wall, the space she had known as home for 2 months. She looked at it for a long time with a seriousness that made her look briefly much older than 6. Then she looked back at her father. "Will we take the stones?" she said. His throat closed. "We'll take every single one," he said. She nodded, satisfied. Then she walked directly over to Douglas Hearn, stopped in front of him and looked up. Hearn looked down. "Are you the man building our house?" she said. Hearn glanced at Elijah, then back at Zoe. "My crew is," he said. "Your dad's going to be running sites for me, so he's a bit busy. But yes." Zoe considered this. "Thank you," she said, with the grave, deliberate courtesy of a child who means it completely. Hearn cleared his throat. "You're very welcome," he said. His voice was slightly rougher than it had been a moment ago. The fort came down that morning. Elijah did it himself, with his own hands, while the crew began laying out the foundation markers around him. He dismantled it the way he'd built it, methodically, carefully, with attention to each component. The tarpaulins he folded and stacked, the pallets he set aside. They would go back to the hardware store skip where he'd found them. The cardboard he broke down flat. He moved with the quiet efficiency he always moved with. But his jaw was tight the whole time. Zoe sat on an upturned bucket nearby, her stone collection in her lap, watching him work with the same serious attention she gave everything. When he took the drawings off the walls, her drawings, every one of them, the houses with red roofs and swimming pools and flowers taller than the fence, she took each one from him and stacked them carefully in the folder he'd bought from the library sale bin for 50 cents, the one that had been keeping them flat and safe for weeks. She didn't cry. She didn't make it sentimental. She just kept the drawings safe. By 9 o'clock, the foundation dig had begun. Elijah stood at the edge of the lot, Zoe beside him, her hand in his, her stone collection in a bag over her other shoulder, and watched Douglas Hearn's crew work the ground where the fort had stood. He watched the way you watch something when you are trying to make it real, when the evidence is right in front of you, but some part of you that has learned to distrust evidence is still running its checks, still waiting for the catch, still listening for the sound of the floor giving way. He felt Zoe's hand tighten in his. He looked down. She was watching the digger with an expression of pure, undisguised wonder, her mouth slightly open, her eyes tracking every movement of the machine with the absorbed attention she normally reserved for library books about animals and space. "Daddy," she said, without looking away from the digger. "Yeah? I always knew the castle was just the beginning." He stared at her. She said it with the complete, unself-conscious certainty of someone stating a fact. The sky is blue, 2 + 2 is 4, the castle was just the beginning. And then she went back to watching the digger. Elijah looked away, looked up at the pale winter sky above the railway underpass, and let his face do briefly and privately whatever it needed to do. The story might have ended there. At the edge of that lot, a father and his daughter watching the ground being broken for a real home. And it would have been enough, more than enough. But that afternoon, something happened that nobody had planned. A woman named Gloria Reyes, who walked her dog past the lot every morning and had watched the fort appear and persist through the winter with a quiet respect she'd never voiced to anyone, stopped at the edge of the lot and asked one of the crew what was happening. The crew member told her. She took out her phone and filmed 30 seconds of the foundation dig, the crew at work, and Elijah standing at the edge of the site with his daughter. She posted it with a single line of caption. "Single dad built his little girl a cardboard house to keep her safe. Today a real one is going up. Clement City, this man is one of ours." By evening, it had 40,000 views. By the following morning, it had 400,000. By the end of the week, Elijah Williams's name was known across the country. But what happened in the days that followed? The calls, the letters, the moment Zoe finally understood the full story of the castle and what her father had done to keep her safe inside it, that is the part of this story that will stay with you longest. We're almost there. Elijah did not own a television. He found out about the video the way he found out about most things that week, from other people's reactions to him. The foreman on the north side renovation site, a quiet man named Bart, who had never once in 3 weeks initiated a conversation that wasn't work-related, walked up to Elijah on Tuesday morning and shook his hand without explanation. 2 of the crew members he passed on the way to the site office nodded at him with an expression he didn't immediately recognize, something between respect and something softer, something that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't name. It was Terrence who told him directly, "You seen the internet today, boss?" Elijah had looked up from the day's schedule. No. Terrence had turned his phone around. He watched Gloria Reyes' 30-second video standing in the site office with his jacket still on. 30 seconds of footage he had no memory of. Himself at the edge of the lot, Zoe beside him, both of them watching the foundation dig, completely unaware of being filmed. Zoe's hand in his, her face turned upward at the digger. 412,000 views. The comments were running faster than he could read them. This man worked through a winter in a cardboard house to keep his daughter safe, and I am not okay. The way she's holding his hand, I can't. Someone find this family and take care of them. This is what a real father looks like. He handed the phone back to Terrence. Went back to the schedule. You all right? Terrence said. We've got a concrete pour at 11, Elijah said. I need the east section cleared before then. Terrence looked at him for a moment. Yes, boss, he said. Douglas Hearn called at lunchtime. You've seen it, Hearn said. Not a question. I've seen it. My office has had 40 calls this morning. Journalists, 2 TV stations, a morning show producer from the network channel. A pause. There's also a children's clothing company that wants to send Zoe a wardrobe, a bookshop that wants to send her their entire catalog, a family in the suburbs who want to donate furniture for the house. Elijah said nothing. I'm not telling you what to do with any of it, Hearn said. I'm telling you it exists. How you handle it is your call. What would you do? Elijah asked. A pause. Hearn considered it seriously. The furniture I'd take, he said. The TV stations I'd leave. The books. Your daughter reads, so I'd take the books. Another pause. But that's me. You know your life. What about the journalists? One, Hearn said. One good one, one time, on your terms. Tell the story once, properly, and it's yours. Tell it 20 times in 20 different directions and it becomes something else. Elijah thought about that. I'll think about it, he said. Take your time, Hearn said. But not too much time. These things move fast, and if you don't shape it, someone else will. He picked Zoe up from school that afternoon and knew immediately that the story had reached the school gates before he had. The other parents were looking at him differently. Not unkindly, not at all unkindly, but with the particular careful attention of people who have learned something about someone that rearranges how they see them. 2 mothers he recognized from the pickup line came over and said things he received graciously and forgot immediately because he was watching Zoe come through the school doors. She came out the same way she always came out. Backpack bouncing, talking before she'd spotted him, full of the day's information. She found him in the crowd, aimed herself at him, and crashed into his side with the habitual affection of a child who has never once doubted her welcome. Mrs. Okonkwo let me read to the class today, she said into his jacket. The whole chapter. Everyone was very quiet. Of course they were, he said. They walked home, to Ashley's apartment where they were staying while the build progressed, sleeping in the living room on a fold-out sofa that Zoe had claimed with great enthusiasm and decorated the first night with her entire stone collection arranged along the windowsill. On the way, Zoe said, Some kids at school said Daddy is famous now. Elijah looked down at her. What did you say? She shrugged, pragmatic. I said you're not famous, you're just my dad. He was quiet for half a block. That's exactly right, he said. He agreed to one interview. A journalist named Priya Menon, who wrote for the Clement City Courier and had a reputation, Hearn's office had checked, for stories told with patience and without sensationalism. She met him at the diner on Clement Avenue, the same booth by the window, and she asked good questions and listened to the full answers and didn't try to make anything more dramatic than it already was. She asked him what he wanted people to take from the story. He thought about it for a long time. I don't want people to think I did something heroic, he said finally. I did what any father would do. I used what I had. I kept the problem in front of me, and I worked it. He paused. The thing I want people to understand is that dignity is a choice you make every day regardless of your circumstances. Not a luxury. Not something that waits for you on the other side of things getting better. You either maintain it or you don't, and that choice is available to you right now, wherever you are. Priya Menon wrote that down. And Zoe? She said. What does she know about all of it? Elijah looked out the window. She knows we lived in a fort for a while, he said. She knows her dad worked hard. She knows we're getting a real house. He paused. The rest of it, the hard parts, the cold nights, what it cost, she doesn't need to carry that. That was mine to carry. Will you tell her one day? He thought about Zoe's map of stones, the largest one in the center. That's the house, Daddy. The smaller ones radiating outward, garden, road, school, library. She already knows the important part, he said. She knows I built something for her when I had nothing. Kids understand what that means. You don't have to explain the details. The build took 11 weeks. Elijah was on site every weekend, not because Hearn required it, he didn't, but because he was constitutionally incapable of watching a build happen without being in the middle of it. The crew had accepted his presence with the easy pragmatism of men who recognize competence and don't ask unnecessary questions about why someone is there. He worked alongside them on the weekends, laying block, framing, running conduit, and during the week he ran the north side renovation with the focused efficiency that had become his professional signature. Hearn watched all of this from a careful distance and said nothing except, on one Friday afternoon when the frame was up and the roof was going on, standing beside Elijah at the edge of the lot, "You know you're going to want to talk about Foreman of the Year at your review." Elijah looked at him. "It's been 6 weeks," he said. "I know what I see," Hearn said, exactly as he'd said it in the diner. The same words, the same even delivery. Elijah shook his head slowly, but something in him settled another degree toward solid ground. Ashley came to the lot every weekend. She brought food, always more than was needed, always in containers that she refused to take back empty. And she sat in a folding chair at the edge of the site and watched the house rise with an expression Elijah couldn't fully read. Satisfaction, maybe. Something older than satisfaction. One Saturday afternoon, when the walls were up and the windows were in and the house was beginning to look like itself, she called him over. He sat beside her in the spare folding chair. She was quiet for a moment, watching Zoe, who had appointed herself site mascot and was currently conducting a highly official inspection of the front doorstep with 2 of the crew members who had adopted her with an ease that suggested they all had daughters of their own. "Your father built things too," Ashley said, not to start a conversation, just because it was true and it was time to say it. "I know, Mama. He built a bookshelf when we first moved into the apartment. Before you were born, we had no money for furniture, so he found timber in the street and he built a bookshelf." She paused. It was not a very good bookshelf. It leaned. I had to wedge a piece of cardboard under one side. She smiled at the middle distance, but I put every book I owned on it and I never took them off. Elijah looked at her. She looked at the house. "He would have been very proud of you," she said. He nodded. Didn't trust his voice immediately. They sat together in the folding chairs and watched Zoe conduct her inspection. And the house stood in the winter light looking like exactly what it was. Something built from nothing, by a man who had learned from the people who loved him that these were not opposites. That nothing was always the beginning of something. That the distance between the two was measured in stubbornness and love, and the refusal to confuse being broke with being broken. The day they moved in was a Saturday in early spring. Not a dramatic day, not a ceremony. Elijah had specifically resisted Hearn's suggestion of any kind of event. No ribbon cutting, no gathering, no cameras. He had shaped his story once with Priya Menon, and that was enough. What happened on the day they moved in was private. He and Zoe and Ashley carried things from the apartment in 2 carloads. The donated furniture had arrived the week before. A sofa, a kitchen table, 2 beds, and the house was already partially furnished, waiting. The books from the bookshop were stacked in Zoe's room in 4 tall piles that she had not yet been permitted to fully explore, a restriction she was tolerating with visible and heroic restraint. They carried things in through the front door. A real front door, solid wood, painted a deep green. Because when Hearn had asked him if he had any preference about the door, Elijah had said green without hesitating and not explained why. The last thing in was Zoe's stone collection. She carried it herself, both arms wrapped around the bag, walking through the front door of her first real home with the stones against her chest and her chin up and her face wearing the expression of someone arriving somewhere they have been navigating toward for a long time. She went straight to her room. Elijah heard the sound of stones being arranged. He stood in the hallway of his house. His house? Solid and real, and built on the ground where he had held everything together through the worst winter of his life. And he put one hand flat on the wall. Brick and mortar, properly footed, built to code. He pressed his palm against it, felt it hold. That evening, after Ashley had gone home with her empty containers and Zoe was in her room surrounded by her stones and the first inroads she'd made into the book pile, Elijah sat on the front step in the early spring evening and was quiet for a while. The railway underpass was still there, 20 meters away, unchanged, the same gray concrete it had always been. The lot looked different now, filled with house instead of emptiness, but the geography was the same. He was sitting more or less where he had sat on that first night, after Zoe had declared the fort a castle and fallen asleep inside it. He thought about $11.40. He thought about cardboard and rope and the cold that got into your bones and the particular darkness of 2:40 in the morning when you were alone in a storm and running on nothing but stubbornness. He thought about a small girl spinning inside cardboard walls with her arms out. Daddy, it's a castle. He thought about stones arranged into a map of a future she had been planning all along. With the absolute unhesitating confidence of a child who has never once doubted that the future exists and that she belongs in it. He looked up at the sky, the same sky that had been above the lot all winter, indifferent and enormous, and he exhaled slowly. Then the front door opened behind him, and Zoe appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, stone in each hand, examining them in the evening light. "Daddy," she said, without looking up from the stones. "Yeah. This is a good house." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She weighed the stones in her hands, satisfied, and went back inside. He sat on the step for a while longer. There is a version of this story that is about a construction company owner with a good heart. That version is true, and Douglas Hearn deserves every word of it. There is a version that is about community, about Gloria Reyes and her 30 seconds of phone footage, about the people who sent books and furniture and kind words into a stranger's life. That version is true too. But the version that matters most, the one that sits at the center of everything else and holds it all up, the load-bearing wall of the whole story, is the version about a man who had $11 and a daughter who trusted him completely. He did not waste the trust. He did not let the circumstances become his identity. He did not let being broke become being broken. He did not perform his dignity for an audience or abandon it when there was no audience. He maintained it in the dark, alone, in the cold, when no one was watching. Except someone was watching. And what Douglas Hearn saw from the curb of that empty lot was not a man in crisis. It was a man at work. There is a lesson in that. About what we project when we think no one is looking. About the compound interest of showing up fully, even when fully is all you have left. About the kind of character that becomes visible only under pressure. The way certain materials only reveal their true strength when weight is applied to them. Elijah Williams built a house from cardboard. And what it turned out he was really building, what the cardboard was always just the surface of, was the life that was waiting on the other side of the winter. It was always there. He just had to hold the walls together long enough to reach it. If this story moved you, if Elijah and Zoe's journey said something to you about your own walls, your own winters, your own stubborn refusal to quit, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the kind of story we bring you every single week. Real human strength. Real turning points. Real proof that the floor you're standing on right now, however it feels, is the foundation of something. Hit subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.